Ken Wilson had always trusted his wife, Kathy. They had been married for 24 years, raising their son, Martin, who was now serving in the Navy. Life was stable, if not always exciting. Ken worked in middle management at an American manufacturing company, while Kathy was a secretary at an insurance firm. They had their routines, their shared moments, and the comfort of a paid-off house. One day, Kathy suggested they put up a privacy fence around their backyard. "Think how nice it would be, Ken," she said with a gleam in her eye. "We could have some privacy, maybe even make love under the stars without the neighbors watching." Ken chuckled at the thought. "Well, if it makes you happy, Kathy. But let's not go overboard with the spending." Kathy found a contractor, Mark Braun, through a colleague at work. She was thrilled with his skills and affordable prices. Ken, however, was starting to feel uneasy. He noticed Kathy's excitement whenever she talked about Mark, and it made him feel inadequate. But he pushed those feelings aside, attributing them to his own insecurities. One afternoon, as Ken returned home from work, he saw Marv Schneider, his 80-year-old neighbor, approaching him. Marv was a kind-hearted man with a sharp eye for details. "Ken, can I have a word with you?" Marv asked, his voice tinged with concern. "Sure, Marv. What's up?" Ken replied, trying to sound casual. "I don't want to get involved in your affairs, but I saw something yesterday that bothered me." Marv began cautiously. "I was out by that new fence when I saw Kathy and that contractor, Mark, getting a bit too close. They were kissing, Ken. After that, they walked into your house, holding hands like teenagers." Ken felt a knot form in his stomach. "Are you sure, Marv? This is serious." Marv nodded, his eyes filled with sympathy. "I'm sure, Ken. I wouldn't have told you if I wasn't." That evening, Ken decided to confront Kathy indirectly. "Hey, Kathy, how's the fence coming along?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "It's going great. Mark is doing an amazing job," Kathy replied, her eyes lighting up. "He's so talented and hardworking." Ken's heart sank. He needed proof. The next day, he set up a small camera near the fence, hoping to catch anything suspicious. That night, he watched the footage and saw Kathy and Mark embracing and kissing passionately. Feeling a mix of anger and heartbreak, Ken decided to confront them the next day. He took the day off work and waited. As he expected, Kathy and Mark showed up together. "What's going on here?" Ken demanded, stepping out from his hiding spot. Kathy's face turned pale. "Ken, what are you doing home?" "I could ask you the same thing," Ken replied coldly. "Marv saw you too. I saw the footage. How long has this been going on?" Mark tried to intervene. "Ken, let me explain." "Don't bother," Ken cut him off. "Kathy, you have 15 minutes to pack your things and leave. And you, Mark, get off my property." Kathy began to cry. "Ken, please, let's talk about this. I can explain." But Ken was firm. "No, Kathy. You made your choice. Now, live with it." As Mark and Kathy left, Marv came over, placing a comforting hand on Ken's shoulder. "I'm sorry, Ken. But you did the right thing." Ken nodded, fighting back tears. "Thanks, Marv. I don't know what I'd do without you." Marv smiled gently. "We're neighbors, Ken. We look out for each other." And with that, Ken began the painful process of moving on, knowing that while his trust had been shattered, he still had the support of those who truly cared for him. Ken Wilson sat in his backyard, staring at the peephole he had drilled in the newly streamed down Kathy's face. "I didn't mean for this to happen. It just did. Please, Ken, let's talk about this. We can fix it." Ken shook his head, his voice breaking. "There's nothing to fix, Kathy. You made your choice when you let him into our home, into our life. Pack your things and leave. You have 15 minutes. Kathy sobbed, reaching out for him. "Ken, please, don't do this. I love you. We can work through this." Ken stepped back, avoiding her touch. "Love? You call this love? No, Kathy. This is betrayal. Get out. Mark tried to intervene again. Ken, maybe we can. Get out. Ken roared, his voice echoing through the house. Both of you, get out. Kathy gathered her things, tears falling as she moved around the house. Ken watched, his heart breaking but his resolve firm. He couldn't believe this was happening. The woman he loved, the woman he had shared his life with, had betrayed him in the worst possible way. Marv appeared at the door, having heard the commotion. He placed a comforting hand on Ken's shoulder. You did the right thing, Ken. Sometimes you have to cut out the rot to let the rest heal. Ken nodded, his eyes filled with unshed tears. Thanks, Marv. I just never thought it would come to this. As Kathy and Mark left, Ken stood in the doorway, watching them go. His heart was heavy, but he knew he had made the right decision. He couldn't let betrayal fester in his home, in his heart. It was time to move on, to heal, and to find a new path forward. Ken Wilson sat in his lawyer's office, the weight of the past few weeks heavy on his shoulders. The neatly framed diplomas and certificates lining the walls seemed to mock the chaos of his personal life. His lawyer, Jane, sat across from him, her expression calm and professional. Ken, the first step is to file for divorce and get a restraining order against Mark. We need to protect your interests and ensure your safety, Jane said, her tone firm yet compassionate. Ken nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. Do whatever it takes, Jane. I just want this nightmare to end. Jane gave him a reassuring smile. We'll take care of it. You deserve to move on with your life. The next few days were a blur of paperwork and court appearances. Ken felt like he was living someone else's life, the betrayal still fresh in his mind. He couldn't shake the image of Kathy and Mark together, the pain cutting deep every time he thought about it. One evening, Ken received a call from Kathy. He hesitated before answering, unsure if he was ready to hear what she had to say. Ken, it's Kathy. Her voice was shaky, filled with uncertainty. What do you want, Kathy? Ken asked, his voice colder than he intended. I wanted to talk about the house, Kathy began. Mark and I want to buy your share. We've put so much work into it, and it doesn't feel right to lose it now. Ken felt a surge of anger. You think you can just buy me out after everything you did? This house was our home, Kathy. You destroyed that. Kathy's voice broke. I know I messed up, Ken, but we've both invested in it. Please, think about it. Ken took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. I'll think about it, but don't expect any favors. After hanging up, Ken sat in silence, grappling with the decision. The house was filled with memories, both good and bad. Could he really walk away from it all? A few days later, Ken met with Jane again. Kathy and Mark want to buy my share of the house, he said, his voice tinged with bitterness. Should I let them? Jane considered this for a moment. It depends on what you want, Ken. Keeping the house might be more painful than letting it go. Sometimes, moving on means starting fresh. Ken nodded slowly. I think you're right. There are too many memories here. It's time to start over. The divorce proceedings moved forward, and Ken agreed to sell his share of the house to Kathy and Mark. He signed the papers with a sense of finality, knowing it was the right decision. One evening, as Ken was packing his belongings, Marv came over to check on him. How are you holding up, Ken? Marv asked, concern evident in his voice. Ken shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. It's been tough, Marv, but I think I'm ready to move on. This house has too many ghosts. Marv nodded. Sometimes, the only way to heal is to let go of the past. You've got a new future ahead of you, Ken. Make the most of it. Ken looked around the house one last time, the memories swirling around him. He felt a mix of sadness and hope, knowing that while this chapter of his life was ending, a new one was beginning. As he closed the door behind him, Ken took a deep breath, ready to face whatever the future held. He had been betrayed, but he had also learned his own strength, and now he was ready to rebuild his life, one step at a time. The days after Ken discovered his wife's betrayal were some of the darkest he had ever known. The shock of the affair left him reeling, and the prospect of divorce loomed over him like a storm cloud. But in the midst of his turmoil, one person remained a constant source of support: his elderly neighbor, Marv Schneider. Marv was always there, offering a steady hand and a listening ear. One evening, as Ken sat on his front porch, nursing a cold beer and his wounded heart, Marv shuffled over and took a seat beside him. "How you holding up, Ken?" Marv asked, his voice gruff but kind. Ken sighed heavily. "Honestly, Marv, I'm struggling. Everything feels like it's falling apart." Marv nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "Been there myself, son. It's never easy, but you're stronger than you think." Ken looked at Marv, grateful for his presence. "Thanks, Marv. I don't know what I'd do without you." Marv chuckled. "You get by, Ken, but it helps to have someone in your corner." One afternoon, Ken saw Mark approaching the house, clearly intent on talking to Kathy. His anger flared, but before he could do anything, Marv appeared out of nowhere, stepping in front of Ken. "You best turn around and leave, Mark," Marv said, his voice firm and unyielding. Mark sneered. "This isn't your business, old man." Marv's eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer. "It is my business when you mess with my friend. You hurt Ken enough. If you don't leave now, you'll regret it." Mark hesitated, clearly taken aback by Marv's determination. With a final glare, he turned and walked away. Ken watched in awe, a mix of relief and admiration washing over him. "Marv, you didn't have to do that," Ken said, his voice filled with gratitude. Marv shrugged. "Someone's got to watch your back. Can't have that scoundrel causing more trouble." Days turned into weeks, and Ken slowly began to find his footing again. Marv was a constant presence, whether it was sharing a meal, watching a game, or just sitting in silence. His support gave Ken the strength he needed to keep moving forward. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Ken turned to Marv. "I don't think I could have gotten through this without you, Marv." Marv smiled, his weathered face softening. "That's what neighbors are for, Ken. We look out for each other." Ken felt a warmth spread through his chest. "I'm lucky to have you, Marv. You've been more than a neighbor. You've been a true friend." Marv patted Ken's shoulder. "And you, Ken, are stronger than you know. Life's thrown you a curveball, but you're hitting it out of the park. Just keep swinging." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ken felt a glimmer of hope. With Marv by his side, he knew he could face whatever came next. The road ahead was still uncertain, but with the support of a true friend, he was ready to take the next step. And so, Ken moved forward, one day at a time, grateful for the steadfast presence of Marv, whose unwavering support had been a beacon of light in his darkest hours. As Ken Wilson packed the last of his belongings into cardboard boxes, his mind drifted back to the day he met Daisy, the dog his friend Tom had asked him to look after. It was supposed to be a temporary arrangement, but Daisy quickly found a place in Ken's heart. He remembered how Tom had pleaded with him. "Ken, I don't know what to do with Daisy. If I get this job out of state, I can't take her with me. Could you take care of her for a couple of weeks, just until I figure things out?" Ken had agreed reluctantly, not wanting to disappoint his friend. At first, Kathy wasn't thrilled about the new addition to their home, but Daisy's sweet nature soon won her over. Ken and Daisy became inseparable, and he found comfort in her company. But when Tom returned and Daisy chose to go back to him, Ken felt a pang of betrayal. "I thought she loved it here," Ken had said to Kathy, feeling a surprising depth of hurt. "But she just left like it didn't matter." Kathy had laughed lightly. "She's just a dog, Ken." She didn't mean it that way. Now, as Ken stood in the empty house that once echoed with laughter and shared memories, he couldn't help but draw parallels between Daisy's departure and Kathy's betrayal. Both had stung deeply, and both had taught him a harsh lesson about trust and loyalty. Marv found him sitting on the porch, lost in thought. "Penny for your thoughts, Ken." Ken sighed, looking out at the yard where the new fence stood. Just thinking about Daisy and Kathy. Funny how betrayal feels the same, whether it's from a person or an animal. Marv nodded, his eyes reflecting a lifetime of wisdom. Betrayal cuts deep, no matter who it's from. But it's what you do after that defines you. Ken rubbed his temples, the weight of his reflections heavy on his shoulders. I thought Daisy was loyal, just like I thought Kathy was. But they both chose to leave. Makes you wonder if anyone can truly be trusted. Marv's voice was gentle but firm. Not everyone is like them. Ken. Trust is a gamble, sure, but it's also what makes relationships meaningful. You've got to learn to trust again, even if it's hard. Ken looked at Marv, appreciating his friend's steadfast support. It's just hard, Marv. How do you let someone in again after being hurt like this? Marv smiled kindly. You take it one step at a time. Start with yourself. Trust that you can get through this. Trust that not everyone will let you down. And remember, not everyone deserves your trust right away. They have to earn it. Ken nodded, feeling a bit lighter. You're right. I can't let this define me. I've got to move forward. Marv patted him on the back. That's the spirit, Ken. Take it slow, and don't rush into anything. You'll find people worth trusting again. As Ken watched the sunset, he realized that Marv was right. The pain of betrayal would always linger, but it didn't have to control his future. He had the power to rebuild his life, one day at a time, and to choose carefully who he let into his heart. And with that thought, Ken stood up, ready to take the first step toward a new beginning. The past was behind him, and while it had shaped him, it did not have to define him. With Marv's unwavering support and his own renewed sense of determination, Ken knew he could face whatever lay ahead.